and welcome to today's crash course. Today's crash course is divided into two parts, and so if you're in a secondary 3 or a secondary 4 student, this video is going to be for you. In the first part, we're going to be talking about constraints and the effects of constraints, also what we call deformations, on certain materials. And then in the next part, part 2, we're going to talk about the mechanical properties of these materials. So let's get started. So before we dive into what a constraint is, let's talk about forces. So a force is an influence that is able to cause a change. And so here we have a couple of examples. We have forces that can apply a change of motion. So if we are dribbling a soccer ball, we can allow that soccer ball to change direction. We can kick it forward. The force can kick it backward. It can even stop its motion. It can also change its direction. Forces can also create a change in shape. So here, for example, the soccer ball again, we have the shoe or the cleat on top of the soccer ball, and it's compressing it, as well as the turf underneath that's pushing it upwards, creating that compression or that force on the soccer ball, changing its shape a little bit. So what is a constraint? Well, a constraint is the effect of forces on the material. Constraints tend to deform materials, so they will dictate the material that is chosen. So, for example, if we take a windshield of a car and tires of a car, they both are different materials because they undergo different constraints. So, for example, the tire will hold the entire weight of a car. It needs to have that versatility to go over bumps. So it's made of a material that will withstand those constraints. However, a windshield is not made of that same material. It's made of a material that is a lot more sturdy to withstand wind and rocks and rain. It is also not meant to withstand or to hold the whole weight of the car. So its materials are chosen based on the constraints. It would be kind of weird if a windshield was made out of rubber and was flippy floppy everywhere. It just wouldn't serve a purpose. So we just have to remember that there are 5 main constraints when we're talking about materials. We have compression, tension, torsion, deflection, and shearing. So we're going to explore all 5 of them in more detail. Which symbol corresponds to compression? Is it A, B, C, or D? The answer is A. So the first constraint that we're going to talk about is the constraint called compression. And it's a constraint that tends to crush or squeeze the material. It is caused by 2 forces applied towards each other at the same point. And so I'm going to show you, you've already seen it briefly, but I'm going to show you how to draw the arrow that will show you how compression is supposed to be. So if I look at how this is drawn, you can see that the arrows are actually, they are empty inside. These display force. Okay, so these are actually showing compression. They are not showing motion. The other type of arrow that you'll see is an actual arrow that's just a line. Those are motion arrows. So whenever you see an arrow that's kind of empty in the middle, like these ones here, they're a little bit more difficult to draw. Those are force arrows, and those demonstrate constraints. So compression, let's talk about compression. And you can see here at the same point. Compression can be used, for example, here in the nutcracker. So compression force is applied at the same points on either side to crush a nut. And you can also see them on these spring games in parks. When someone sits down on the spring, it compresses with the ground. And so we have that compression happening at the exact same spot. The next constraint we're going to talk about is tension, a constraint that tends to stretch the material. And it is caused by 2 forces applied away from each other at the same point. So if we look at how our arrows are going to be drawn for tension, again, they are arrows that are, see, they have space. They're not just lines. They're kind of 2D type. And they look like this. So this is our tension arrows. And as you can see, they are pulling apart. The forces are going in the opposite directions at the same point. Now, here it's horizontal, but it doesn't matter. Vertical, it can be in any direction as long as they are coming from the same point. Which of the following situations describes tension? Is it A, a suspension bridge bends under the weight of people and bicycles? Is it B, a school bus is parked on the side of the road? C, a water skier is secured to a boat with a cord? D, a tree is trimmed with gardening shears. The answer is C, a water skier is secured to a boat with a cord. So when one is water skiing and they're holding on to that cord that's attached to the boat, they're pulling back on the cord while the boat is moving forward, creating that tension on the rope. The same thing can be said for a tug-of-war game. So you have one team on one side that's pulling, and then you have another team on the other side that's pulling in their direction to see who will win. So tug-of-war is a perfect example of the force of tension. Our next constraint is called torsion. Torsion is a constraint that tends to twist the material. It is caused by two rotating forces applied in the opposite directions. So if I go to my box over here, I'll show you how we draw it. So it's basically the same type of arrow, but they're chasing each other. So again, we'll do it this way. This one's a little trickier to draw. So again, it's two forces that are kind of going in opposite directions. So if you want to think, for example, of wringing out a towel or a piece of clothing after it's been super wet or fallen in some water, you're wringing it out. That's a force of torsion. You're applying that constraint. Another example is when we have aerial artists or gymnasts, when they're on that ribbon or that rope, when they're swinging from it, it's undergoing that constraint of torsion. What constraint is applied to the hammock? Is it A, shearing, B, tension, C, torsion, or D, deflection? The answer is D, deflection. Our next constraint is deflection. And deflection is a constraint that tends to bend the material. It is caused by two forces applied in the same direction and a third force applied between them in the opposite direction. And so instead of two arrows, we have three this time that we're going to draw. So we have our first arrow that is going to apply a force downward in this case. And then our other two arrows are going to apply forces upward. And these ones are usually a little bit smaller, because the force is not as great. So it kind of looks like that. So when we look at examples, here's a perfect example of where we have the two forces of the trees. They're holding up the hammock, and then someone comes and sits in it. So the force that kind of deforms the hammock is pulling downward. So it's a greater force, so it has a bigger arrow. Another example is where we have a crayon or a pencil and we bend it, we try and bend it. The force that's applied by our hands pushes against the crayon and it moves forward. Now eventually though, if enough of that force is applied, the pencil's going to break. So a choice of material really matters when we think about constraints. And finally, the last constraint is shearing. And it's a constraint that tends to cut the material or tear it or rip it. It is caused by two forces applied in opposite directions at slightly different points. So I'm going to show you how this arrow looks, because it's basically an arrow cut in half in two different directions. So if we look how this works, there's our first arrow in one direction, and then I take the tip of this guy and I try and reflect it. It's going to go down. And there's an example of a shearing arrow. Okay, it's a little bit tricky at the beginning, but you get the hang of it. So you can see that we have two different opposite directions coming together at a slightly different spot. So what's really important to remember is that shearing is not the same as compression. Compression is where two forces meet at the exact same spot. Shearing is where there are two opposite forces that kind of miss each other. It's a little bit off center. So if you remember shearing, very much like cutting, scissors are shearing. Shears, when we're used to like gardening shears, it's in the word. It also is an example of a force that's applying two opposite forces that are a little bit off center to create that rip, to create that tear apart. So if you're getting a little confused or you're unsure about how to make sense of all of these constraints and these different force arrows that I just showed you, think of Play-Doh. You know, Play-Doh that you used to play with as a kid. Think about you have a container of Play-Doh and you are going to roll it all together and smush it. and you smush it down, you apply pressure to it to make like something that's very flat. Well, that's an example of compression. So after that, maybe you want to pull it a little bit apart, stretch it a little bit to make it bigger. Well, that's tension. Or maybe you want to make it into like a little bit of like a rope effect and you want to turn it in two different directions. That's torsion. Or maybe you want to push down and make thumb imprints inside of your Play-Doh to make those indentations. That's deflection. Or maybe you want to take your Play-Doh scissors and just cut a bunch of little pieces in it to make little pieces for whatever it is that you're doing for your Play-Doh. That's shearing. And the cool thing about forces and constraints are that you don't have to apply just one. Sometimes certain materials, there are multiple different constraints and forces that are applied to an object at the same time. So remember that gymnast that we saw, that was hanging from a rope? We see him in Cirque du Soleil sometimes. Well, they're not only just applying torsion, but tension, right? Because that rope is holding them up in the air and they're rolling down that rope doing all kinds of acrobatic things. So that material is undergoing more than one constraint. But there's one thing that we kind of have to keep in mind when we're dealing with forces and constraints is that they can cause deformation. So the first type of deformation we're going to talk about is elastic deformation. And it's just like what it sounds. It's a type of deformation where the material returns to its original shape on its own. So I could take a stress ball and I could deform it and squeeze it and compress it in class or in a moment of stress. And I'll let it go, and it will return to its original shape on its own. The same thing will go to an elastic band. If I pull my elastic to put my hair in a ponytail and I let it go, it'll go back to its original state on its own. So that's elastic deformation. The next deformation that we could encounter is called plastic deformation. And this is a type of deformation where the material does not return to its original shape on its own. So if I take the example of this deformed by deflection paperclip, it will stay that way unless I apply another constraint to bend it back to its original shape. So it won't go back on its own. It needs a little help. And finally, the last type of deformation is a fracture. And fracture is a result of such a significant deformation that the material will break. And so we have many different types of deformation in this area, like for example, shearing. Shearing of metal, that is a fracture. It cannot go back to its original state. And if we also can have bones that will fracture under an immense amount of a constraint. It's also worth mentioning that it depends on the intensity of the constraint, so the intensity of the force applied. If you take an elastic band and you pull it so hard to the point where it snaps and breaks, well, that's fracture. So even an elastic band can fracture and rip. There you have it. So we've talked about the 5 different constraints that exist, their arrows, as well as the 3 types of deformation. So hop on over to part 2 so you can check out the mechanical properties of materials.